brutal reality of marching in a Roman legion was one of the harshest and most grueling experiences any soldier of the ancient world could endure, a daily ordeal that demanded not only immense physical stamina, but also unyielding mental resilience. To understand it is to strip away the glorious image of shining armor and triumphant formations seen in modern imagination, and to look instead at the dirt, the sweat, the blistered feet, the suffocating heat, the unending weight of the pack, and the psychological pressure of knowing that at the end of the march often awaited another battle, another fortification to build, or another frontier to tame. Life as a legionary was defined by the march. It was the spine of Roman military power, the invisible labor that held together the victories celebrated in marble arches and written in the annals of emperors. And it was brutal in every sense of the word. Every legionary carried his world on his back. Roman military organization dictated that a soldier be able to move swiftly, self-sufficiently, and in strict order. This meant that the average legionary bore not only his weapons but also a pack filled with tools, supplies, and equipment. Contemporary accounts and archaeological reconstructions suggest weights ranging from 30 to 40 kilograms, sometimes even more, strapped to his body as he marched mile after mile. Within that burden was his armor, whether chainmail, scale armor, or the famous segmented plate, his shield, his gladius, and his pilum. But it also included a cloak, rations, cookware, stakes for building fortifications, and even a shovel or pickaxe. The Roman soldier was as much a laborer and engineer as he was a fighter, and his pack reflected that reality. The nickname Marius's mules, given to them after the reforms of Gaius Marius, was not affectionate. It reflected a very real truth. The march itself was a ritual of discipline and endurance. Roman training instilled the ability to march up to 20 miles in a single day, while fully equipped, and this was not an occasional feat. It was the standard expectation. Day after day, the legion moved in unison, their sandals striking dirt roads, rocky paths, and muddy fields alike. Dust would rise in choking clouds on dry summer days, coating skin, hair, and armor, until everything turned the same shade of gray-brown. In the rains of autumn, or the cold winds of winter, the same men slogged knee-deep through mud, their feet soaked, their leather gear heavy and sagging with water. Frostbite, heat exhaustion, infections from blisters, these were the constant companions of the soldier's march, and yet they were never excuses to stop. The Roman army functioned like a machine, and for that machine to work, its parts had to keep moving. Falling out of step, lagging behind, or failing to carry one's load was not tolerated. Punishments could be brutal: lashes, loss of rations, or even death in extreme cases of desertion or failure. The very cohesion of the legion depended on every man knowing his place in the column, maintaining formation even when exhausted, and trusting that the discipline drilled into them would carry them forward. In the ancient world, where roads were not always paved, where mountains and forests stretched endlessly, and where enemies could ambush from hidden terrain, the ability of thousands of men to move as one was both the secret weapon of Rome and the torment of its soldiers. Consider the psychological strain. A legionary did not march through friendly lands most of the time. He marched through foreign territories, often hostile, where every village might harbor resentment, where every shadow in the woods might conceal an ambush. The constant vigilance, the scanning of hillsides, the tension of listening for unusual sounds, added a mental weight heavier than the pack itself. Sleep was often broken, short, and uncomfortable. After a day's march, the legionary did not collapse into rest. Instead, he was expected to build a fortified camp, driving stakes, digging ditches, raising palisades, transforming raw earth into a military stronghold before night fell. Only then, after laboring with tools as much as with weapons, could he sit by a fire, eat his ration of bread, grain, or salted meat, and finally let his body sag into exhaustion. The food itself offered little comfort. Legionaries survived largely on hard grain, ground into meal, and baked into coarse bread or porridge. Meat was rare except when the army could hunt or slaughter animals from the countryside. Water was essential, but not always pure, and soldiers sometimes drank wine mixed with water to avoid sickness. During long marches through barren lands, rations could run dangerously low, leaving men to march hungry, stomachs gnawing as much as their blistered feet. There was no room for softness. Hunger was simply another part of the march, endured with the same stoic resignation as pain and fatigue. Blisters became open wounds, infections spread, joints swelled with strain. The sandals caligae worn by legionaries were sturdy but unforgiving, open to the elements, with iron hobnails on the soles that made every step on stone reverberate up the leg. The sound of thousands of hobnailed sandals striking the earth was described as thunderous, but for the man wearing them, it could feel like relentless punishment to his feet and knees. Modern soldiers wearing cushioned boots with medical support cannot imagine the agony of week after week in Roman sandals, walking over jagged rock, hot sand, or icy ground. Yet the legionary endured, because endurance was the very foundation of his life. The brutality of marching was not limited to the physical body. It was tied into the relentless routine. There was no individuality on the march.
A man was one among thousands, a cog in the vast imperial machine. He marched when ordered, stopped when ordered, ate when allowed, slept when permitted. Songs, jokes, and camaraderie certainly existed, but there was always the overarching sense that the Legion belonged not to its men, but its men to the Legion. Identity was forged in unity, but at the cost of constant self-denial. To fall out of line was to endanger not just oneself but the unit, and the Legion tolerated no weakness. The climate only deepened the ordeal. Under the burning Mediterranean sun, armor could become a furnace, the metal scalding to the touch, sweat pooling beneath helmets, salt stinging eyes. In colder campaigns, in the forests of Germania or the damp plains of Britain, icy rain drenched the men, chilled them to the bone, and froze their hands until gripping a weapon was torture. Yet still they marched, because the Empire demanded it, and because the only alternative was disgrace, punishment, or death. Even the roads themselves, those marvels of Roman engineering, could be double-edged. On smooth stone-paved highways, the pace was swift but merciless, with hobnailed sandals sparking and chafing against stone. On rougher tracks, mud sucked at every step, or dust-filled lungs and choked throats. When armies moved off-road, into wilderness, they often had to cut their own paths, hacking through forests or leveling ground as they went. Every man carried a tool, and every march was also a labor project. For many legionaries, years of service meant years of marching. Campaigns could last for decades, with soldiers posted far from home, seeing their families rarely, if ever. The march was their life, the rhythm of their existence, each sunrise signaling another day of endless steps. Some grew hardened, others broke under the strain, but all of them shared in the same unrelenting trial. The grandeur of Roman conquest was built not in moments of battlefield glory, but in the ceaseless trudging of iron-shod feet across endless miles. At the heart of this brutal reality was a paradox. The same marches that crushed men also bound them together. Shared suffering forged bonds deeper than friendship. Comrades leaned on each other, shared food, helped carry burdens when one faltered. The Legion was merciless, but within its ranks grew loyalty, fraternity, and a sense of belonging that could make even the most brutal march bearable. This was the glue that allowed Rome to project power across continents, the human element that kept the machine from collapsing under its own demands. The brutal reality of marching in a Roman legion was thus not a story of simple suffering, but of endurance transformed into discipline, of hardship shaped into strength. The legion's dominance was not merely about tactics or weapons, but about the capacity of its soldiers to endure more, to carry more, to march farther and faster than their enemies. Every triumph carved into Roman stone carries behind it the invisible sweat and pain of countless marches, the long agony of blistered feet, and the endless burden of heavy packs. For the legionary, glory was rare, comfort rarer still, but the march was constant. It was brutal, unforgiving and unending, and yet it was also the beating heart of Rome's might. The soldier of Rome knew this truth. The empire's victories were bought not only with blood in battle, but with miles on the road, with aching backs and weary legs, with hunger, thirst and exhaustion endured day after day. To march in a Roman legion was to surrender oneself to a life of relentless hardship, to carry the empire on one's shoulders, and to know that survival, discipline and brotherhood were the only comforts one could hope for. That was the brutal reality of marching in a Roman legion, a truth carved not in marble, but in the footsteps of men who bore the weight of Rome across the known world.
The pack on a Roman soldier's back was never just a pack. It was a small, portable world that weighed like a conviction. When you try to imagine what marching in a Roman legion felt like, begin with that weight, because everything else, pain, endurance, routine, discipline, hunger, companionship, was anchored to it. The image people often hold of the Roman soldier is shiny armor, disciplined ranks, a perfect formation advancing under a banner. That image is true in shape, but not in daily texture. Up close, the march was a grinding procession of bodies bearing tools as much as weapons, a continuous, exhausting act of labor disguised as movement. To march in a Roman legion was to be both mule and craftsman, fighter and engineer, citizen and cog. The nickname Marius Mules, given after the reforms of Gaius Marius, captured this truth without flattery. The soldier was expected to carry his life with him and keep moving. A legionary's kit was comprehensive because the Roman military regarded mobility and self-sufficiency as strategic weapons. A typical load could reach 30 to 40 kilograms, sometimes more in a campaign where supply lines were stretched or local requisition meant grabbing extra goods. Within that load sat his armor, the heavy rectangular shield rounded at the edges in some epochs, the gladius, and one or more pillar. It held a cloak that doubled as bedding, a cooking pot, basic cooking utensils, a supply of hard bread and grain for porridge, a small ration of salted meat when available, spare sandals, a leather water bottle, stakes for building the defensive palisade, a shovel or pickaxe, rope, and the odd personal talisman or letter from home. The Roman soldier's gear reflected the army's expectations. Wherever a legion went, it expected to build order from chaos. Each man was a tiny construction crew, and when legions moved, they did so with everything necessary to dig, stake, and fortify at the end of the day. The march itself hardened men who would otherwise never have imagined themselves capable of such endurance. Roman training insisted on marching long distances while fully equipped. A daily pace of 15 to 20 miles on a good day became an unspoken minimum rather than a heroic exception. Marches could be longer when circumstances demanded, forced marches to relieve or surprise a foe, or to cover ground before supplies failed. The terrain did not yield kindly. Soldiers walked across stone roads where every hobnailed step sent a jolt up through the ankles, across fields turned to clinging mud by rainstorms that sucked at their boots, through scrub and forest where roots and hidden ruts broke a steady cadence, and over stretches of sun-baked sand where heat shimmered like a living thing above the earth. In winter the cold bit through wool cloaks and numbed fingers until gripping a spear was a test in pain tolerance. Sometimes the road offered the brief mercy of engineered paving, more often it demanded improvisation, cutting a track, hauling a ditch, or forcing broken terrain with nothing but human muscle and stubborn rhythm. Feet were the center of the soldier's world and often its most vulnerable part. The caligae, the rough-soled, hobnailed sandals associated with legionaries, were durable and practical for many surfaces, but they were unforgiving. After hours of marching, blisters formed in patterns that marked battle as much as marches, thin white skin peeling, raw patches weeping salt and blood. Left untreated, a blister could become infected, gout and joint inflammation could develop from constant impact. Soldiers learned remedies, boiled wine soaks, poultices, second skin repairs with cloth, but these were stopgaps in a life where pain was constant and medical care rudimentary at best. For many men, the march meant learning to move in spite of the body's protests, to regulate breathing, to shorten strides, to shift the pack just enough to take stress off an ankle, and even then, the body punished in other ways, knees swollen from repetitive stress, hips ground by the constant sway of heavy equipment, shoulders raw where straps chafed. It was not rare for a soldier to continue a march while nursing an injured foot, because the alternative, being left behind, meant shame, punishment, or worse. The physical toll was only one piece of the crucible. Marches through hostile or foreign lands placed an almost constant psychological strain on the soldier. Men who were farmers, artisans, or townsmen before enlistment found themselves surrounded by unfamiliar languages, strange customs, and occasional acts of hostility from local populations who might see the marching legion as an invader rather than an army bringing order. Every crow on a fence line, every rustle in a hedge, could be reason to spike nerves. The soldier had to balance fatigue and vigilance, eyes scanning for ambushes, minds parsing landscape for vantage points, and hands ready to slap the scabbard or heft a pilum. Sleep, when it came, was thin and often broken. After a day's march, the routine did not end with repose. The troops had to build a camp, digging a ditch deep enough to deter surprise attacks, piling earth into a protective rampart, setting sharpened stakes in a palisade, and organizing tents or shelters. This was muscle work, performed after hours of walking. It turned the march into a full day's labor that blurred the line between soldier and laborer. At dusk, only when the camp was secure and guard posts set, could a man sit with whatever rations remained and try to calm the hum of exhaustion beneath his skin. Food rarely rescued the mood. The legionary diet was hearty and functional, not indulgent. Grain formed the backbone of sustenance, wheat or barley ground into meal, and baked or boiled into a coarse bread or porridge. When the army could, it stretched rations with legumes, vinegar sour water mixed with wine posca to make water safer and more palatable, and the occasional salted pork or fish. Fresh meat was a luxury, dependent on hunting or local procurement. The taste of a warm loaf after a day of marching could be transcendent, but too often rations ran low in sustained campaigns. Hunger sharpened the senses in a way that both focused and weakened a soldier. It turned every rustle in the brush into a possible source of danger or a potential foraging prize. Drinking water without boiling it was risky. The practice of diluting wine helped avoid dysentery and other waterborne illnesses, but it was a practical compromise rather than a comfort. Discipline undergirded everything. The Roman legion was not a loose band but an ordered machine in which each component had a role, and deviation could compromise all. Training drilled men to march in precise formation, to obey orders even when exhausted, and to treat the unit's needs as greater than the individual's. The consequences for failing to meet these expectations were as real as the weight of the pack: floggings, reduction of rations, demotion in standing, or in extreme situations, execution. Mutiny and desertion were treated harshly. Courts-martial could be swift and public, and punishments severe to deter others. The discipline was not solely punitive, it worked because it provided predictability. Every man knew the routine, the cadence, the signals. That predictability was, paradoxically, a shelter. When the world outside was unstable and dangerous, the rhythm of the march and the certainty of commands offered a kind of security, the mental framework that allowed men to perform despite the physical and psychological costs. The environment added cruel variation. In the heat of summer, the metal of armor and helmet caught the sun and held it like a furnace. Sweat streamed into eyes, making salt sting and breathing labored. Men learned to ration their energy, to march without haste to conserve breath, to carry their cloaks rolled for shade or pillow.
In colder climates such as the northern forests or damp British plains, garments soaked and froze, fingers cramped into unresponsiveness, and the constant dampness led to skin and respiratory maladies. Terrain offered its own hazards. Crossing rivers could mean losing gear to currents, while steep passes demanded a different type of endurance, arms and legs both hauling, pack straps sliding, and the cadence of marching replaced by the rhythm of climbing. When roads existed, they were marvels, stone-paved arteries that could speed an army's movement and reduce exposure to fatigue. Yet the Roman road could also be a metronome of wear, the steady clack of hobnails on stone that numbed joints over miles, and the lack of field cover that turned marching troops into visible targets. Often legions had to leave roads, plunge into woods, or force a path where none existed, and the work required to make the way was another demonstration of soldiers as laborers. The act of setting up camp after a march was symbolic of the dual nature of the legionary's life, always moving, and always prepared to make a small defensible world wherever he stood. Camps were constructed quickly but methodically. Men dug ditches and used the excavated earth to build ramparts. Stakes sharpened painstakingly were driven into place. Tents or makeshift shelters were arranged with the precision of tiny town blocks. The discipline and efficiency of camp construction was both a practical necessity, safety from surprise attacks, and a psychological reprieve. When the palisade was built and the ditch dug, there was a sense of momentary triumph. The night would hold sentries and quiet complaints, and men might trade stories, perform small acts of kindness, or share the last of a cooked ration. These moments of camaraderie, crude jokes, shared pipes of strong drink, the soft exchange of a letter torn down to fit in a boot were crucial. They stitched individuals to each other and to the idea of the legion. Bonds formed under stress are often the strongest bonds because they are born of mutual survival. A soldier who had marched with you for days, who had helped lift your pack when your shoulder failed, who'd wrapped a poultice around your foot, this man became a brother. That shared history mattered more than the thought of home acres away. Camaraderie was also practical. Men learned to help each other share burdens, to rotate carrying heavier items when one faltered, and to scavenge together when supplies were thin. A simple act, sharing a crust of bread, carrying a comrade's water flask, or adjusting a strap, could mean the difference between a man recovering and a man broken down. The social structure of the unit reinforced this mutual dependence. Officers cared for order, centurions enforced discipline, and sometimes brutal punishment, but they also mediated within the ranks, and the unit's cohesion often relied on local unofficial hierarchies who could be trusted, who was steady in a fight, who had a knack for mending gear. These informal networks could make the brutal routine survivable. The march was also a strategic instrument. Rome's ability to move armies quickly and consistently over long distances separated it from many of its adversaries. Where other powers had seasonal levies that marched sporadically, Rome cultivated a standing force trained to mobilize, march, and build fortifications with unmatched speed and efficiency. This capability allowed Rome to conduct surprise maneuvers, reinforce threatened positions, and maintain control over far-flung territories. The visible advance of a legion had psychological as well as physical effects. It demonstrated power, deterred rebellion, and carved a path for political control. But on the level of the man on the road, these grand strategic advantages meant yet more miles, yet more days under the sky, carrying the empire's requirements on his back. The concept of endurance as a weapon was not metaphor alone. The army's doctrine assumed that its ability to outlast and outmarch enemy forces could win conflicts before battle formations even engaged. Armies could be worn down by distance and deprivation, supply lines stretched and frayed, local populations intimidated into submission. The Roman soldiers' capacity to march day after day, to build camps when exhausted, and to maintain discipline under hardship was as much a tactical advantage as the well-drilled use of the pilum and gladius. It allowed Roman commanders to seize opportunities, to press advantages, and to punish hesitation in foes. For the men themselves, understanding that their toil served a larger purpose might be a mental balm, but the comfort was small in the face of the immediate grind. And yet that same grind produced paradoxical human rewards. The monotony and hardship of marching, the shared struggle to survive each day, created intimacy and loyalty that few other shared experiences could match. Soldiers wrote letters to families, carried charms and tokens, and maintained rituals that kept them tethered to their identities. On the road there were moments of laughter, crude songs shouted in unison to keep cadence, a private joke about a centurion's temper, or a quiet exchange about the crops back home. These flashes of humanity made the march bearable, and turned the legion into a community. The soldier's identity was forged in part by this contradiction. The man who surrendered certain freedoms to the regiment could claim, in return, a belonging and purpose that made even brutal days meaningful. In the end, the reality of marching in a Roman legion was a study in trade-offs. Men traded comfort for pay, and in many cases the promise of land upon retirement. They traded personal autonomy for the safety and advantages of serving under a powerful machine that could deliver plunder, pensions, and a civic identity. They traded present ease for the prospect of future reward, and for the tangible pride of belonging to an institution that had remade the world. The cost was steep, aches that never quite left,
scars both visible and invisible, the long absences from wives and children, and the knowledge that in certain battles the cost could be final. But if the march was brutal, it was not senseless. Every hardened step, every night of cold, every improvised meal contributed to a history of movement that built empires. Forts rose overnight, where camps were hardened into permanent installations. Roads followed the trace of boots, linking towns and making governance possible. Trade and annexation followed in the wake of marched legions. In a sense, the world we now call Roman was literally boot-made. The empire's map was a record of marching men and the infrastructures they forced into being. The glory of triumphal arches and the ink of histories hide under their surfaces the countless miles that made success possible. To imagine marching in a Roman legion is to step into a life where endurance mattered more than heroics, where the small acts of carrying, digging, and standing watch built the conditions for victory. It is to imagine long columns, not just of disciplined men but of the innumerable small choices that let them keep going, a shared ration split by comrades, a makeshift bandage wrapped by a friend, a whispered line of a song to make the miles less empty. The brutality was indisputable, the blisters and the hunger, the cold and the scouring sun, but so was the tenacity and the capacity to turn suffering into a technique. That technique, more than any single weapon or tactic, was the mechanism behind Rome's expansion. A reader may close this imagining with the awareness that the life of a legionary was not simply a litany of suffering, it was a craftsmanship of survival. Men were molded by the demands of the march into actors capable of extraordinary consistency. They learned to carry weight and to keep step. They learned to build safe havens out of hostile ground, and to treat exhaustion as merely the next obstacle to be managed. They learned, perhaps most importantly, to rely on each other. That reliance, formed step by step on long roads and under indifferent skies, was the human heart of the machine. It turned brutality into brotherhood, and marching into something like meaning,